Numbers chapter 31, if you would open your Bible with us. We've been going through the 40 years in the wilderness as we've been looking at the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and now we're coming toward the end of the book of Numbers, and then we have the book of Deuteronomy ahead of us. And you just realize that whenever you come to the scriptures and you're going, especially in these Old Testament books of the law, there's the tendency for us to think that has no relevance for our lives today. And I look at this particular text and I think it's probably one of the most difficult passages that you face in the scripture. And yet I think it's so important that you and I understand the nature of God and the way that God deals with situations. And I think this one here this evening is one I think has great value for all of us. I was reading an interesting article this week. If you get a chance to look it up, I would encourage you to do it. It's the Barnes Institute. They do a lot of surveys and they do a lot of questionnaires asking what people believe and what their belief system is. And they did a survey, and this was a survey of weekly attending Christians that believed that their faith was important to their everyday life. And the survey concluded that only 17% of that group have a biblical worldview. Guys, that's scary to think that regular attending Christians, people who say they believe that this book is God's word, only 17% of them, when questioned, had a biblical worldview. And I think, one of the problems that we face is there's just so much counter views being introduced into our lives that it's hard for us to decipher what right and what wrong is, unless you're someone who's spending time in the Word of God. And I think that's why it's so valuable, guys. Not only, the New Testament, we understand the grace of God and love of God, but understanding the grace and the character of God from the beginning. It's the only way you're going to have a picture of who God is in his entirety, right? And so we're going to do this evening is we're going to look at a very difficult passage, but I think it's only difficult if you don't understand the character and the nature of God. You have to look at the context of the whole picture if you're going to walk away from this chapter and have any kind of grasp or understanding of who God is. Because the first casual reading through this book, you go, wait a second, why would God do that? And I think until you kind of look at the whole picture, you're going to be left, walking away from chapter 31 of the book of Numbers with a lot more question than answers. And so I want to do tonight is I want to take some time to kind of back up a little bit and not just look at the single event, but to look at the heart of God and the things that God had already established with the nation of Israel and with the world as a whole. Now, we're told in the book of Genesis that God had spoke to a man by the name of Abram. And when he had talked to Abram, let me ask you to turn real quick, Genesis chapter 12. And I think, again, we're laying down a foundation, and I think it's an important one. Look at Genesis chapter 12 with me as you go back to the 2,000 years after the creation is what we find in Genesis chapter 12. And it tells us that God spoke to this man, and look what he says in chapter 12, verse 1. He says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is a covenant that God is making with a man by the name of Abram. We also know him as Abraham, as his name would be changed at a later time. And Abraham, at this point, was instructed to go into the land of Canaan. And as he went into the land of Canaan, God was going with him. God was going before him. And the scripture tells us that he went by faith, not knowing where he was going. He just heard what God said, and he believed God. And because he believed God, God was now guiding his life and directing his life. And God had made a promise: whoever blesses you, I will bless, and whoever curses you, I'll curse. And then as you come to the 15th chapter of the book of Genesis, God makes a promise that he was going to give him the land that he was on. This is now the promised land. And I share all this with you because the children of Israel are now about ready to enter into the promised land. And watch what happens in Genesis chapter 15. Look at the 13th verse. And God said to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And also the nations whom they serve I will judge, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." And the rest of the chapter talks about God making a covenant with Abram by taking a sacrifice, the torch going down the middle of that sacrifice, and God is affirming that he's going to give them this land. And the reason that he wasn't going to give them the land at this point is because the sins of the Amorites, those who were occupying the land, had not yet been completed. In other words, God was telling him there's going to be a very specific time when God is finally going to bring his judgment upon this land, and he's going to judge them for all of the idolatry and all of the sin that they were committing. And yet God was patient, but yet God knew that the time would come for his judgment to come upon the people. Now, all of that is what God was accomplishing as we come through the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers and the book of Exodus. Is that they went into the land of, they went into Egypt for 4 generations and for 400 years, I should say, and then God comes and he brings them out of the land, right? And so everything that God said was happening. And this is the amazing thing. They're now about to go into the land of Canaan, just like God had promised. And yet they're still on the other side of the Jordan, and there was a certain group of people, the Midianites, who had conspired against them to cause them to sin, and before they ever go into the promised land, God's going to deal with the Midianites. And he was going to fulfill the promise that he had made to Abram. I will bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you. And he's going to also bring vengeance upon this group of people, and it's not pretty. And let me just back up for a moment, guys. War is never pretty. War is never something that we would wish on any country or any people or any nation. But there's some times that war is necessary. And those times that war is necessary, it's explained to us in the scripture that a nation has been set up throughout the world, and those nations have the authority to deal with evil. And the book of Romans chapter, I think biblical worldview, I think it's important that we understand, because I think we have, this whole mindset that, we should never go to war. There's never a reason to go to war. There's never anything that would be a justified war. But yet, watch what it says in Romans chapter 13. Check this out. It says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Watch what he says in verse 3. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. Look at verse 4. For he, that's the authority, is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister to and an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. You see, the governing authorities exist because God put the governing authorities into place. And their responsibility and their role is to avenge evil. And as we come into this passage, we're going to see that evil is going to be avenged. And it's not a pretty sight. It's not something that you would wish upon any people, but God has the authority to do that, because he's the one who we all give an account to. And one day, God is going to judge the whole world. One day, there's going to be, the whole book of Revelation is telling us how the end of the world is going to take place. And it's not by, a worldwide war. It's not going to be by any kind of, famine per se, even though all those things will be happening. It's not because of that. It's because of man's rebellion against God. And God one day will judge. The book of the second chapter of Psalms, again, we're laying down a foundation. I'm going to ask you to turn there again with me to another passage, Psalm chapter 2. And I think, again, just that important reminder of just who has that authority. Look what he says in Psalm chapter 2. He says, why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. And he who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Then he shall speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion, and I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I'll give the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Now, therefore, be wise, O kings. Be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are those who put their trust in him. Man, what an incredible psalm, because he's telling us not only the Lord, but his son, Jesus, and his wrath one day is going to come upon the world. And it's not going to be something that, anyone's going to want to be on the wrong end of. right? I mean, when the Lord comes and he brings judgment upon the earth, and as we look at this, this chapter in chapter 31, I think it's important that you keep it in perspective of who's commanding this, and you keep it in perspective of why he's commanding it. And then as you're looking at this, understand that one day, man, God is going to judge everything and everybody. I remember Edmund Burke, he said this: the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. In other words, if no one's going to stand up for what's right, guys, then evil will permeate the earth. And what are we seeing happen today? We're seeing evil triumph in our world. And our role is to stand up for what truth and what right is, no matter what the consequences. And it's interesting. Look at chapter 31. We're going to jump into the text, and I tried to premise it. I tried to prepare you for it. But here we go. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel. Afterwards, you shall be gathered to your people." And guys, what God is telling Moses, this is your last assignment. You're going to be, when God says you're going to be gathered to your people, it means, Moses, you're going to die once you complete this task. And Moses was aware that he wasn't going into the promised land, that he was going to see the promised land, but he's never going to enter into the promised land. And he's saying, look, I got one more thing for you to do. You're going to take vengeance on the Midianites. Now, why the Midianites? What did the Midianites do? If you go back to chapter 25 and chapter 26, you'll remember with me that the Midianites had plotted to curse Israel. They had hired a spiritual guru of their day by the name of Balaam. And they asked him to go on top of the hill and to bring some kind of curse upon the nation. And every time he would go up, the Lord would tell him, you can't do that. And he did it multiple times. And finally he goes, look, I can't do anything. But the king, Balak, said, look, if you don't do it, then you're not going to get the money that I promised you. So I don't know what to tell you, man. And Balak came up with a plot, or Balaam came up with a plot, and he had told Balak, if you can get the children of Israel to fall into idolatry, then God will curse them. And he enticed them to sin. And he enticed them to have sexual relationships with the young Midianite girls, and then to bring them into the worship of Baal. And he listens to his counsel. He brings them into this idolatrous relationship with these women, and then God brings a curse, and 24,000 men died in the curse. But God had told Abram, if you would curse Israel, then God would curse you. And now here comes the curse of God. He says there is going to be vengeance upon these people because of their plot and their enticing of the nation of Israel. And then notice what happens. Look at verse 3. And I think again, the verbiage is very, very distinct here. Watch what he says. So Moses spoke to the people, saying, arm some of yourselves for war. Let them go against the Midianites to take vengeance for the Lord on Midian. Guys, this wasn't Moses' vengeance, and it wasn't Israel's vengeance. This was the Lord's vengeance. And the men of Israel were going to execute the vengeance. You see, vengeance doesn't belong to me, and it doesn't belong to you. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. And yet God was going to use these men as the instruments to bring together his vengeance upon the people. And Moses is just doing exactly what the Lord had told him to do. And he says in verse 4, 1,000 from each tribe of all the tribes of Israel you shall send to war. So there were recruited from the divisions of Israel, 1,000 from each of the tribes, 12,000 armed for war. And Moses sent them to the war. 1,000 from each tribe, he sent them to the war with Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, with the holy articles and the signal trumpets in his hand. It's interesting that Phinehas was the one who took the spear. It went into the tent where one of the children of Israel was having sexual relationships with the Midianite woman, and he took the spear and he stuck it to the ground through both of them. And what an incredible picture here. Because what he's doing is that Phinehas is the one who stopped the plague, and now Phinehas is going to be the one who leads them into the battle as they go and they bring this vengeance from the Lord to the Midianites. And Phinehas, the priest, would be the one who was given the mantle, and he would go in with the holy articles. Guys, what's happening here is a holy war. Think about this. They're going in with the holy articles. They're going in with the command of God to go and to bring a great destruction upon the Midianite city. And then watch what happens. And they warred against the Midianites, just as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed all the males. They killed the king of Midian with the rest of those who were killed, Evi, Rechem, Zur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian, Balaam, the son of Beor, they also killed with the sword. Remember, this was the false prophet or the spiritualist that was bringing the curse and explained to them how to get the children of Israel to be enticed to sin. And he was also killed in this battle. And it was something that was very, very vicious and very descriptive as they went in, and every male, man, they wiped out. Except, watch what he says, the children of Israel took the women of Midian captive with their little ones, and they took as spoil all of their cattle, all of their flocks, all of their goods, and they burned with fire all of the cities that were dwelt and all of the forts, and they took all of the spoil and all the booty of man and beast. Wow. Could you imagine? I mean, this was, just a full-on raid of a city, a full-on, total destruction of a city, taking all of the valuables and keeping it for themselves, and then, taking the women and thinking, they're gonna take them as hostage, as they'll become our wives, they'll become our slaves. And then look at verse 12. And they brought the captives, the booty, and the spoil to Moses, to Eleazar the priest, and to the congregation of the children of Israel, to the camp in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. And Moses and Eleazar the priest and all of the leaders of the congregation went to meet them outside the camp. And then it tells us, but Moses was angry with the officers of the army, with the captains over thousands and the captains over hundreds who had come from the battle. And Moses gets all of these, he's gathering all of the leaders together, and he's saying, what are you guys doing? What makes you think that these women who enticed the men to sin are going to escape the judgment of God? And it's a heavy passage, because Moses at this time is going to have them kill all the males, including the children. He's going to have them kill all of the women that had known a man. And you go, man, doesn't that seem a little bit radical or a little bit harsh? But I think there's a bigger picture that God's wanting not only all of the nations around to listen to, but the nation of Israel to understand, is that sin always has a consequence. The wages of sin is death. And when you're enticing someone to sin, you have a greater accountability to God for the actions that you take. And so God is going to lay out for them that these women that are in the midst of the land are going to have a responsibility for their actions. Guys, tempting someone to sin holds a great responsibility. Jesus says, if you make one of my little ones to sin, it'd be better for you to cast a millstone around your neck and to throw it into the depths of the ocean. There is this responsibility that a person takes whenever he's enticing someone. And these women had enticed the men of Israel to sin. You know, that doesn't excuse the men of Israel for doing what they did. Matter of fact, James would tell us, he said, let no one say when he's tempted, I'm tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. He says, but each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and he's enticed. And when the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, it brings forth death. He says, look, sin is just like a conception. You take that thought, you take that idea, and you just let it sit there long enough. And it'll begin to grow, and it'll begin to grow, and pretty soon it'll produce death. When it's conceived, and then you allow it to sit there, it will bring forth death. So it wasn't relieving the responsibility of the children of Israel and the temptation that they gave into, but there was also the accountability for those gals that came and tempted them to do it. And what's incredible is that God isn't just going to say this to these foreigners. God's going to say that to the very people that would be in the camp. And I think that's an important point. You see, we look at that and go, man, that's mean, that's harsh. I mean, is God that cruel? But it wasn't just the foreigner that he's addressing this with. Guys, understand something. God was going to tell the children of Israel, if someone within the camp entices you to sin and to go after idols and to commit idolatry, then they're to have the same fate that they do. Well, watch what it says in Deuteronomy, and we'll be getting there shortly, but I think just for the context, Deuteronomy chapter 13, beginning in verse 6, watch what he says. If your brother, the son of your mother, the son of your son or your daughter, the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is as your own soul, secretly entices you, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which we have not known, neither nor you nor our fathers, of the gods of the peoples which are around you, near to you, or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, you shall not consent to him or listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare him or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people. And you shall stone him with stones until he dies, because he sought to entice you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And understand something, guys. We're dealing with the law here. We're not living in the age of the law. We're living in the age of grace. But as you're looking at the law, that doesn't mean that you go home and say, I know someone who's trying to entice me to sin. I'm going to go stone him. Don't go there, right? We're living in the age of grace. We're not under the law. We're not living by the law. But I think it does reveal to us the heart of God here. It reveals to us that one day God is going to bring judgment upon the world, and he is going to bring vengeance upon those who have not only given themselves over to idolatry, but those who are enticing others to do the same. And what's incredible about this whole picture is that God is encouraging the children of Israel, and all the nations around are going to have a very clear understanding that if you're going to live a life that's going to be in rebellion to God, there's a consequence for that life. And judgment will come one day. Now, it didn't come immediately. It was chapter 25 when the events took place. It's now in chapter 31 that the vengeance takes place. And just because you don't see the consequence of that sin immediately doesn't mean that there's no consequence. Matter of fact, he's going to, at the end of that, there in Deuteronomy, or actually in the end of James chapter 1, it says, don't be deceived. Don't be deceived, my beloved brethren. He would say in another passage, he's going to say, don't be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that's what he's going to reap. Don't be deceived. Don't think that because I don't see the consequences for my actions today, that there's no consequence. Because God is a God of grace, and he is a God of mercy, and he always gives the opportunity for a man to repent and to turn from his sin. But one day that line gets drawn, and he says, now you cross the line, or the time period has come to pass, and now there's no longer an opportunity. It's heavy. Because, you can read this passage and you just kind of overlook it and you kind of go, man, that don't even seem right. It don't even seem like the God that the Bible describes, but it very much is. A God who will one day bring vengeance upon a world that's rejected him. And here, that vengeance was something that was visible, and it was something that was evident in the life of the Midianites and then the nations around. And now, when they go into the promised land, they're going to have many more of those wars. They're going to have many more battles because it was the sin of the people of the land that was being dealt with. But it's interesting that wasn't supposed to happen on this side of the Jordan. It was supposed to happen on the other side of the Jordan. But because of the enticing, God was saying, hey, they cursed you, now I got to curse them. Because the promise of, think about what the ramification that is for us as a nation. Guys, I don't see anywhere in the Bible where that is no longer valid or was somehow wiped away when God told Abraham, I'll bless those who bless you and I'll curse those who curse you. And I think one of the reasons that we have been blessed as a nation is because of our backing of the nation of Israel and the promises that go along with that. And I believe, as we're watching our world and, just as we turn away from the nation of Israel, then you have to ask the question, what's the consequence going to be for us? It's heavy. And one of the things that you notice here, we're going to continue. Look at verse 17 here. He says, now therefore, kill every male among the little ones. Kill every woman who has known a man intimately. But keep alive for yourself all the young girls who have not known a man intimately. And as for you, remain outside the camp for 7 days. Whoever has killed any person, whoever has touched any slain, purify yourselves and your captives on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. And purify every garment, everything made of leather, everything woven of goat's hair, and everything made of wood. Then Elijah the priest said to the men of war who had gone into the battle, this is the ordinance of the law which the Lord commanded Moses. Only the gold and the silver and the bronze and the iron and the tin and the lead. Everything that can endure fire, you shall put through the fire, and it shall be clean, and it shall be purified with the water of purification. But all that cannot endure fire, you shall put through water, and you shall wash your clothes on the 7th day and be clean, and afterwards you may come into the camp. And God gives them the instruction that after all of this, that they were all of the stuff that they had gathered together, gold, silver, bronze, everything that was gathered, they had to put it through the fire, and then anything that wouldn't endure the fire, they had to wash with water. And the whole idea was that there had to be a cleansing of the stuff, right, before it ever came into the camp, and the cleansing of the men before they ever came into the camp. Now, look at verse 25. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, count up the plunder that was taken, man and beast, you and Elijah the priest and the chief fathers of the congregation. Divide the plunder two parts between those who took part in the war and went out to battle and all of the congregation. Levy a tribute for the Lord on the men of war who went out to battle, one of every 500 of the persons, the cattle and the donkey and the sheep. And so God was going to get 1/500th of it. And then that's divided, directly in half for the men who went out to war. And then he says, verse 29, take from it half and give it to Elijah the priest from the heave offering to the Lord. And from the children of Israel, half you shall take, one of every 50. So 1/50th shall be from the persons, the cattle, the donkey, the sheep, from all the livestock. Give them to the Levites who keep charge of the tabernacle of the Lord. And Moses and Elijah the priest did as the Lord commanded Moses. The booty remained from the plunder which the men of war had taken was 675,000 sheep. Can you imagine? 675,000 sheep. Dude, these guys had some cattle, right? I mean, and they were now going to divide that between those who had went to the battle and the rest of the nation that had stood behind. And they were going to, what's entering 1/500th was going to be given to the Levites, and 1/50th of the second half was going to be given to the Levites. And so really, they're only giving God about 2% of everything that had come in. I think it worked out to 2.2%. Just a small margin of what had been taken was to be given to the Levites and to the service of the Lord. Now watch what happens. The booty remaining in the plunder which the men of war had taken was 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, 32,000 persons in all, of women who had not known a man intimately, and half the portion of those who had gone into war was in number 336,500 sheep, and the Lord's tribute of the sheep was 675. And the cattle were 36,000, of which the Lord tribute was 72. The donkeys were 30,500, or the Lord's tribute was 61. The persons were 16,000, of which the Lord tribute was 32 persons. And Moses gave the tribute, which was the Lord's, a heave offering to Elijah the priest, as the Lord commanded Moses. And from the children of Israel, half of which Moses separated from the men who fought. Now the half belonging to the congregation was 375,600 sheep. And he gives us all the numbers. Drop down to verse 48, because he gives us all the details, what got divided amongst the people. And then look at verse 48, and here's where I want to put a little attention. Watch what he says. Then the officers who were over thousands of the army, the captains of the thousands, the captains of the hundreds came near to Moses, and they said to Moses, your servants have taken account of the men of war who are under our command, and not a man of us is missing. Wow. All of these men. Now think about what's transpiring here, guys. Everyone who went to war came back from that war. And they're acknowledging, man, this was a God thing. How do you go to war and not have one casualty? How do you go to war and not one person's missing out of all of the 12,000 that were sent into war? 12,000 had come back from the war. And really what I think is being exemplified to the nation of Israel is when you obey me, you have safety and security, and you have God fighting the battle for you. And when you live a life of disobedience to me, then there's always casualties. We're going to see the children of Israel go, and they're going to fight against Jericho, and then they're going to go to a second battle of Ai. And when they go to Ai, they're going to 37 men die. And those 37 men that die was a result of Achan, who had taken what he wasn't supposed to take for himself. And the children of Israel going, God, why aren't you with us? Why aren't you going with us? He goes, no, don't get on your knees and complain that I'm not going with you. Why don't you find out where the sin is? Because I can't bless sin. And if you're going to live a life of rebellion to me, how do you expect me to bless that? And the children of Israel have to cast lots, and they find out Achan was the bad guy. And then they ask Achan, what did you do, man? Honor the Lord. Tell us what you did wrong. And he says, I took some gold. And I took some of the other stuff, and it's hidden under my tent. And then they go and they find the gold, and they find the stuff, and they pull it out, and they take him outside the camp, and they stone Achan. That's why he was called Achan. No. All of his family, all of his possessions were stoned because Achan was bringing sin into the camp because of his actions. It's crazy, guys. God is trying to solidify to their hearts. If you live a life of obedience, man, God will blow your mind. And you go into a battle and you don't have one person dead. And you have to come to this conclusion that, man, God has been gracious to us. And God honors obedience. And he honors those who are willing to obey him. And that's his continual character. Notice the next verse here. It says, therefore, we have brought an offering for the Lord. What every man found of ornaments of gold, ornaments and bracelets and signet signet rings and earrings and necklaces to make atonement for ourselves before the Lord. And here's what they did. God only required the 2% for them to give to the work of the tabernacle and to the Levites. But now they understood, you know what? Man, we want to bring an offering to the Lord of all of the things that we collected while we were in this battle, the gold, the bracelets, the earrings, all of the stuff that we were putting into our pockets. Man, we want to bring, and we just want to acknowledge that God has been gracious to us in our life. And that was an offering that was exceedingly abundantly anything that God had asked of them. And this is how they saw it. This was an atonement for ourselves. What a picture. This is the idea of atonement, guys, is that there was a payment made on my behalf. And the whole idea of atonement is acknowledging that I was a slave, but now I've been set free. That I was in bondage, but now I'm no longer owned by somebody. That someone atoned me. Someone was willing to pay the price, and they realized this. Look, what we deserved was to be in bondage and slavery, and we're no different from those Midianites that were just killed, but by the grace of God, he's protected us. And that's true of my life, and it's true of your life. But by the grace of God, he's protected us. And he's purchased us with his own blood. And the wages of sin is death. The only difference is that the atonement of Jesus Christ paid the price that I should have paid for myself. And this free will offering was nothing God required of them. It was this free will acknowledgement that God, you own me now. I'm yours. You purchased me with your own blood, and I don't even own my own life anymore. And the children of Israel understood it now. And I think because of it, they're now going to be men who walk by faith rather than by sight. They're going to go into Jericho, and they're going to take very clear instructions from the Lord. And they're going to do crazy things. Like, I want you guys to march around the city for 7 days. How ridiculous is that? We're just going to go walk around a city for 7 days. It makes no sense. It has no logic behind it whatsoever. On the seventh day, you're going to march around it 7 times. And then you're going to blow a trumpet. I'm sure that's going to scare them, huh? And as they're obeying the Lord, man, it tells us that the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. And the people were living in fear because the fear of the Lord had come upon them. They're going to learn that when you live a life of obedience to the Lord, then God honors that. And when you decide that God is the one who's in control of my life, and this isn't for me to try to figure out, it's for me to obey. And I think here, on this side of the Jordan, God is going to use this lesson in their life to learn to live a life of faith rather than a life of sight. And guys, that's the journey that you and I are on, learning to walk by faith, learning to trust the Lord, knowing that my life's been atoned for. I owe him everything. Everything I possess, it's not even mine. It's his. And am I going to be faithful with that? My time, my talent, my treasures, every opportunity that God, am I going to be faithful with those things? Because God's the one who opened up those doors for us. And what's amazing in this whole picture is that God, look at verse 52. We got to finish it up. Watch what he says. Verse 51, so Moses and Eleazar the priest received the gold from them, all the fashioned ornaments and all the gold of the offerings, and they offered it to the Lord from the captains of the thousands, the captains of the hundreds, was 16,750 shekels, and the men of war had taken the spoil, every man for himself. And Moses and Eleazar the priest received the gold from the captains of thousands and hundreds, and they brought it into the tabernacle of meetings as a memorial for the children of Israel before the Lord. And at that point, man, all of this gold that was brought in, it was a reminder, look at God's faithfulness. Look what happens when we obey the Lord, as he had brought forth all of this additional wealth into the tabernacle so that the children of Israel would be continually reminded, when you obey God, man, you have God's favor. And that is true, God, of my life, and is true of your life. When you obey God, you have his favor. And you and I are living in a day and an age where we, it is a constant battle that we're in against the philosophies of this world and all of the different worldviews that are being pointed at us, and it's really this battle where you got to decide, man, am I going to believe the God of the Bible and what he says about himself, or am I going to believe what I feel or what the rest of the world is saying? I was reading in that article I had mentioned that 37% of Christians believe that all religions pray to the same God. Church attending by people who believe their faith has value in their life, and 37% of those believe that it doesn't matter what God you pray to, that we're all praying to the same God. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. How do you line those two views up? And yet we're living in a time where all of these things are being thrown at us, and then all that God is looking for a person. One of the other questions is that you be a good person and you go to heaven. And that's a great idea. If you're just a good person, you get to heaven. But the problem is there's no good people. We're all messed up, right? The only way you get to heaven is by the grace of God. And yet within the church, only 17% of those who attend church on a regular basis actually believe what the Bible teaches. God's character, God's nature, God's truth. God help us. God help us as a nation, and help us as a world that is punted when it comes to who God is. Because you have to ask the question, man, what is the ramifications for that in the world we're living in. When we no longer think that what God says is true.